Well, good afternoon. How is everybody? End of the conference, eh? Is everybody as tired as I am? Yes? Well, I know you would be. You stay up quite late, Mr. Wozniak. Thank you for coming to one of our closing plenary sessions today. My name is Frank Porporino, and I'm on the board of ICPA, also on the program committee of ICPA, and I welcome all of you to what I think is a very special session. ICPA stands for Humane, Effective Corrections. That's based on evidence, not on myth, not on bias, not on opinion. And we all know that government oftentimes easily dismisses evidence, but as corrections professionals, we also all know that we need it. We need it to make any meaningful steps forward. Unfortunately, we turn to researchers and academics for that evidence, and oftentimes we get confusing, inconsistent, incomprehensible, and in many cases, things that are really, at the end of the day, just full of hot air, and leaving practitioners with difficulty in making conclusions. Well, today, folks, we're very privileged, I think, very privileged to have someone who is a true scholar, someone who I've known for many years. He is not just an acknowledged, world-renowned expert. He has written more books than I can keep up to read. But he's also firmly kept a good part of his attention in the field. And he listens and talks to practitioners, works with practitioners, advises managers, advises policymakers. He began doing that in England. He is recognized widely as the founder of What Works, the spark of the What Works agenda in the UK, and is now in demand all over the world to present and give of his ideas. We're lucky enough to have him here today, Professor James McGuire. He's a professor at forensic clinical psychology at the University of Liverpool. He's also director of their clinical psychology program. He began his career working in high security hospitals. He is involved in doing court assessments, parole board assessments, mental health review assessments. He designs programs. He writes wonderful articles and papers and does fantastic research. And he has integrity, focus, and objectivity. And I'm proud to present him to you to give his conclusions about where he thinks corrections should focus its attention. So, my dear friend, Professor James McGuire.
Thank you very much, Frank. Can everyone hear me okay? It's going to be... Oh, I've lost the little machine. It's going to be hard to live up to those very generous comments, Frank. I will try to do so. I'm kind of going to present a fair amount of evidence on various things that work and don't work to reduce offender recidivism. But my key aim, if you like, is to forward an argument for reducing the extent of dependency that we appear to have in many countries on the use of the prison as the central plank in the enactment of criminal justice policy, and make far more use of community-based sanctions and sentences. And I want to give you reasons for that, because it's not simply a dream. It's something that many, many people actually argue for, but it appears nevertheless to be very difficult to put into practice. So these are my objectives. I'm going to characterize broad approaches to the problem of criminal conduct. I'll tell you a little bit about a major UK initiative that was done in the early part of this decade called the Pathfinder Evaluation Project. I'll then very, very quickly skip over the current state of knowledge of outcome research in this area and comment on the comparison between effective and ineffective interventions. But my main objective then is to try and push forward this agenda item that I have about transferring resources from custodial to community settings, from prison to probation or some other community correctional agencies. I'll provide you a rationale for that based on 2 or 3 what seem to me quite sound evidence-based arguments. And if that seems a very difficult departure to make, I'll offer a couple of historical precedents for how that's been done in quite different areas, but which if you think of you being a surveyor and you triangulate from different angles, you would be able to see your objective and get the size and scale of it. I suppose if we really wanted to be serious about reducing crime on a macro level scale, one of the kinds of data we could pay attention to is the relationship between inequality of income distribution and serious crimes such as homicide and robbery. These are data that were collated by the World Bank under the auspices of the World Bank about 7 or 8 years ago. This regression line actually shows that there's quite a strong, statistically significant association between the rate of inequality. This is 39 different countries, 37 different countries. The likelihood of that happening is, as you probably guessed, quite low. The evidence from many countries is that inequality is increasing, although there are some where it's decreasing. But if we wanted to make a large effect in terms of the criminal statistics, I guess these are the kinds of things we would do. What you and I do is at the tertiary level, after the offence has been committed, the person has been processed by the courts and sentenced, the criminal justice system has a pretty tough challenge to face to try to then have an impact on someone. But these are the things it tries to do. This is the kind of crash course on the philosophy of the purposes of sentencing, retribution, incapacitation, deterrence, rehabilitation and restoration. In England and Wales, those are the 5 reasons that sentencers are asked to give for why they're imposing a particular sentence on an offender. And in fact, magistrates even have to say what proportion of a sentence is being allotted for different reasons to serve those different kinds of purposes. So that's quite a good exercise to do if you're thinking about sentencing. But sentencing in many countries is actually dominated by a particular kind of thinking. And it's the idea of deterrence. And people often regard deterrence as the central pillar of... we talk about retribution, but we don't actually act in the spirit of retribution as Immanuel Kant, the philosopher who espoused this idea, actually wanted us to do. So we talk about deterrence, and we talk about it in 2 main ways. One's called general deterrence, the expectation that the public visibility of punishment will deter prospective offenders, and there'll be a broad suppressant effect of official punishments. So around the world, many criminal justice jurisdictions act as if this man had got it right. His name is Cesare Beccaria. He was an Italian philosopher, and he founded the School of Classical Criminology. And he wrote a famous book in 1764 called On Crimes and Punishments. I won't attempt the Italian. He forwarded the view that individuals calculate the benefits and costs of actions before deciding what to do. The principal means of influencing them if they commit crimes is to increase the costs by punishing them, making it unpleasant and painful for them to do so. The modern equivalent of this idea is the irrational crime theory and various other variations on it, such as situational crime theory. Now, we do act as if we think this is true. These are the statistics for the growth of the use of imprisonment in England and Wales, where I live, since the beginning of the last century. So over a period of 110 years almost, the number of people in prison has gone up considerably. So we do seem to think, society seems to think, courts seem to think that this is what will work, this is what will bring about a change. And maybe it has an effect. We'll have a look at that. Possibly the most widespread idea around general deterrence is the use of capital punishment, that if we want to deter the rate of serious crime, we execute people. And this is still practiced in a number of countries around the world, including, I'm sorry to say, Singapore. One of the things that we do with this is obviously you cannot deter the offender specifically because he or she is gone. But you can have a general suppressant effect on crime in the community. Is this actually true? Well, you may have seen a paper published last year by Frank Zimring and his colleague Hawkins, comparing the rates of serious violent crime in Singapore and Hong Kong over a period of about 40 years. And these two graphs show you the rates of homicides and serious violent crime in Hong Kong, which is the unbroken line, and Singapore, which is the broken line. Now, in some ways, these are similar societies. They're 4 or 5, 6, 7 million. Similar ethnic distribution. They are similar in many ways economically, and even have a quite similar GDP per capita. So they make almost a good case study, and they call this a tale of two cities. This is the telling difference between them, however. The last person to be executed in Hong Kong was executed in 1967. And in fact, in 1993, the death penalty was removed from the statute books, so it didn't exist anymore. But all during that period, no one was executed. Across the same period in Singapore, the dotted line in the lower graph is the rate of homicides. Pardon me. The rate of executions. And for a time, Singapore carried out more executions than any other country in the world. But as you can see, it made no difference whatsoever to the shape of the graph over a period of time. There is no evidence of a general suppressant effect. The rate of serious crime in Singapore started to fall before the death penalty was introduced. The rate in Hong Kong remained stable whether or not they had the death penalty. So the idea of general is suppressant and general deterrent effect is not very well supported by these data. And there are similar comparisons between Texas and other American states that use the death penalty less. In the criminal justice system, we're also interested in specific deterrence. That is, do we reduce the recidivism of the offender, him or herself, by carrying out various kinds of penalties? So will punishment reduce or suppress the likelihood of criminal acts in those who've previously committed them? One way to answer this is to compare people who've been dealt with in different ways within the criminal justice system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about evaluation research, focused on direct work with adjudicated offenders. And this is mainly done in research in two main ways. One is through what are sometimes called demonstration programs, usually randomized groups to two different conditions, with or without treatment, with or without harsher punishment. And this gives us a measure of what's called efficacy. And these are quite valid experiments. But in the everyday routine world of common standard practice, it's very difficult to do that. Allocation is not done randomly. So we evaluate what are called practical programs using quasi-experiments. So you have a group that are sentenced, and they may be have to attend some kind of program, or they may be allocated to higher levels or lower levels of security, and we compare them with another group that isn't treated in this particular way. And there are quality control statements mentioned there, the consort statement, the trend statement. If you want to publish research in this area, you need to adhere to the standards within those. And there's been a steadily growing volume of outcome studies since these were first reviewed using what's called meta-analysis in 1985. In fact, by the middle of this year, I've just done a summary of these. There are now 94 meta-analyses or systematic reviews that have been published comparing different kinds of interventions with each other, or looking at the effects of moderators such as age, gender, ethnicity, the quality of program delivery, risk level, and a variety of other factors on them. And what's emerged from this is the effectiveness that we most want appears, on the basis of this evidence, to be best achieved using structured programs, which means specially designed sequences of learning opportunities. They are formed by a theoretical model of what causes crime and designed to influence risk factors for involvement in crime. The idea of being able to do them on more than one occasion has taken hold, so they're not based on the day-to-day or session-by-session discretion of a counsellor or a therapist or a trainer or a teacher. They're put into a manual so they can be reproduced on different occasions in different places. People, in order to run them effectively, have to be given special kind of training. Now, I'd like to say something briefly about the theoretical basis of these. Based on the idea that a maxim that I think is pretty good by a man called Kurt Levine, who was a social psychologist, there's nothing more practical than a good theory. The most effective programs that we've obtained so far are based basically on a behavioral kind of model of conditioning, but primarily on the third version of this, which is called cognitive social learning theory. And this is based on the idea that what individuals do at any moment in time is a function of them as individuals and of the situation that they are in. This rather elaborate-looking model, which is one of the most recent versions of it, developed by a man called Walter Mischel, shows different factors that influence personality development over time. And they feed into what he calls the cognitive affective personality system. Rather than thinking that people will be consistent across situations, they actually adapt themselves to different situations. The interesting thing for us will be under what circumstances, at what times, and with which other people will someone commit an offence. Is it possible to predict that? So if so-and-so is in such and such a place, will an offence be more likely than others? And we can then see that the consequence in some case will indeed be a crime. Now, Mischel and his colleagues have actually elaborated on this to try and bring it closer to neuroscience. So this is the notional mind-brain, the inside of you or anyone else. And these little circles represent circuits that have learned behaviour, sequences that we act out, from very simple things like knowing how to read and how to write, to your habitual reactions when someone looks at you with a stare, which you've probably learned, and there's a circuit there that supports whatever you then do, which might be you know to look away, or you start to feel yourself getting angry, and possibly you might become aggressive. There's actually a lot of evidence now that the learning experiences that people are exposed to over time actually influence the way that their brains are structured. These are some examples from cognitive neuroscience. If you learn to play a musical string instrument, it actually changes the shape of your brain. I know this seems hard to believe, but people do expert things such as instrument playing with their brains. Their fingers are merely the mechanisms by which this is executed. People who drive cabs around London and have what in London they call the knowledge, knowing all the streets of London, which takes about 2 years to learn, so I'm told. Unfortunately, not all London taxi drivers have the knowledge, but many do. And it actually changes the shape of a part of the brain called the hippocampus, because you have stored spatial memories there. And this has been shown using magnetic resonance images of the brains of London taxi drivers. If you learn 2 languages, and many people here speak at least 2, your brain is differently structured from that of a person who only speaks 1 language. And if you start that earlier in life, then that's correlated with larger brain changes than if you start to learn the second language later in life. Now, these factors are also influenced by socioeconomic background, and that may have something to do with the long-distance likelihood of becoming involved in crime. But the reason I'm telling you about this is that when we apply certain kinds of psychological therapy in mental health, there is now evidence that this changes the brain. These are mental health problems that have been studied using magnetic resonance imaging scans. I've gone too far, sorry. Depressive disorder, spider phobia, generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder. These are quite common mental health problems. And this is the amount of therapy that someone has been given in some structured experiments on this. So 12 hours, 8 sessions of an hour and a half, an average of 17.25 hours here. And using functional magnetic resonance imaging scans, which are ways of detecting the activity of the brain, it's been found that this induces changes which are lasting changes in the structure and activity of the brain. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is because when we use structured programs in prisons and probation, we actually expose people to quite a lot more hours of cognitive behavioral activity. I've searched the literature and I can't find any study on this, but it would seem to me that it's highly likely that there will be changes in brain activity and brain structures as a result of this, but to my knowledge, and if anybody knows about this, please say later, because I'd like to know if this has been tested. There would be ethical issues about asking participants, people in the criminal justice system, to take part in experiments like this, but it's perhaps worth a try. So the briefest program is still longer than most of the CBT therapy that we saw, and some, like reasoning and rehabilitation, is quite a lot of exposure to trying to learn to think in a different way. Applying that model to actual criminality, we arrive at a derivative of it, which is called the RNR, Risk Need Responsivity Model, which it says the kinds of things that are here, that you identify the general risk factors for offending, which might be identifying situations where someone is likely to commit offences. And I'll show you a list of what some of those are in a moment, but I think everyone's familiar with that. You then analyse the offences that someone committed and try to formulate what will alter those, the propensity, the likelihood of doing that. And you then deliver interventions that will change the risk level of them doing that. These are some of the best known risk factors. Developmentally, poor parental supervision, low attachment, being exposed to physical or emotional or sexual abuse, having lots of friends who are involved in delinquency and crime, antisocial attitudes, distorted information processing, thinking other people are not to be trusted, thinking other people are going to get you unless you get them first, poor skills for social conflict resolution, for resisting pressure, etc., and low levels of control over your own negative emotions, difficulties in dealing with complex encounters with other people. These are all risk factors for offending. So what we try to do in programs is to try to address those using the best validated approaches, which I'm going to be focusing on, what are known as cognitive behavioral approaches, which are derived from that model and derived from the earlier model I mentioned of cognitive social learning theory. And these are a range of interventions that most of the currently used programs contain in different kinds of combinations, like the ones on that previous table. They contain all these kinds of things. If we apply that, I'll give you an example of a program which I wrote myself. It's called Think First, and it's been used in prisons and in probation in the UK and also in Australia. This is its theoretical structure is to try and help people to learn problem-solving skills and then apply them to the acquisition of greater self-control, interaction with others, and influence attitudes and values. And the problem solving involves a sequence of training exercises, each of which takes 2 or 3 hours, like this. These are some exercises for analysing an offence. So you take a crime you have committed and you look at what you were doing beforehand, your behaviour at the time, what happened afterwards. You do that for several offences, and you also look at the factors that were associated with that offence and see if you can identify patterns, and that would enable an individual then to be able to plan ahead and avoid the crime next time around. And while that is happening, some cognitive change is taking place, and perhaps also changes in neural structures, we would hypothesize. If you measure the short-term effect of that in prisons, you can get graphs like these. This is done in 3 prisons in England, where impulsivity is measured before the program, after the program, and then several weeks later, equivalent to the same amount of time that the program took. Socialization increases and goes up. These are various short-term effects, but what we're interested in are long-term effects, of course, so I won't dwell on those. We've also tried to validate these programs in the UK using a system of accreditation, and some of the people present at this conference have been members of expert panels to judge those programs and decide whether or not they're suitable for use. So these are criteria that are used, and again they're very much drawn based on the theory and evidence that I've briefly mentioned so far. A program is scored as to its usefulness or not on these dimensions. And currently in England and Wales, we have a large number of programs that have gone through that process. These are ones used in prison service, and these are ones that are used in probation settings. These are now, as you've heard earlier, under one common management called the National Offender Management Service. The majority of these programs, not all, but the majority use the cognitive social learning model. There are also some that use 12 steps models, which is a different approach, for example, to addiction, and therapeutic community models, which involves a different model, but the majority are cognitive behavioral. I want to tell you briefly now about the results of some of these interventions in probation settings. The research I've been involved in was part of the United Kingdom's crime reduction program from the year 2000 onwards, where a large amount of extra resources were provided to set up programs in prisons and probation. And these were mainly manualized programs because the idea was to roll them out to a very large number of sites. This involved a large amount of staff training and had a research and evaluation component. Here's one of our findings. This is comparing 3 of the main, most widely used cognitive skills programs in probation settings. And these are amongst the largest samples ever studied in an evaluation project of this kind. 2,500 people in probation and 3,000 in the comparison group. And these are the rates of completion, reoffending for people who completed the programs. As you can see, they're a lot lower than for the comparison group, although those for the dropout groups are quite a bit higher. These are highly significant statistics in terms of using regression models. This is a survival graph for a period of about 17 to 18 months for the people on the programs. Using our most sample that we were able to be satisfied was the most clear-cut set of data, because a lot of the data was rather complex and messy. If you don't have random allocation, people will always say you can't show that you're getting an effect due to the program because there might be selection bias. There might be differences between the groups that you don't know about. So what we tried to do in one study of this, I'll just skip that one, was to compare 2 models. This is using something called propensity score analysis. Basically, you do several sets of calculations. One is to see whether your predictor variables, that's things like age, number of previous offences, age at first offence, risk prediction score, predicts completing the program or not. And then you do the same and see whether that predicts reoffending or not. You then compare these 2 models statistically. If there's no difference between the 2 models, then there probably is selection bias. That probably means that the people who did well were going to do well, which is what is often said. If there is a statistically significant difference, then the selection bias isn't there. The likelihood of offending or not offending is probably being influenced by the program. So here's how this turned out when you do this for these programs. You actually get a highly significant differences. This divides the sample into five groups on the distribution of the measures that are available. I'm sorry this is rather complex, but it's a very simple message at the end of it, which is that most of the offenders were in the higher risk groups. And these are the numbers here. And you can see here there are highly statistically significant differences between the 2 models. In other words, there is likely a treatment effect that can be detected, although we don't have randomized allocation to groups here. I want to then look at how we can judge the outcomes of services as a whole, and what can we say about the likelihood of reoffending and whether we can change it. In the UK, we do this a lot of the time by comparing predicted scores with actual scores in recidivism. Now, this is done in several countries. We use something called the Offender Group Reconviction Scale, which was developed by the Home Office's Ministry of Justice Research Development Statistics section a number of years ago, and it's now in its third version. It's what's called a static predictor, and it involves putting together a number of pieces of information about an individual, and it then yields a score. Now, going back to this table is also meant to demonstrate to you that based on a review of these measures by David Farrington and his colleagues, that the OGRS comes out pretty well. It's the second best predictor of violence as compared to the Canadian measure, which just kind of wins the prize here, the GSIR. So it's as these measures go, and they're by no means perfect, it does reasonably well. It's reasonably accurate as a predictor. So let's go back to the bad old days of the 1990s before the crime reduction program happened. These are predicted and actual rates of people given 4 sentences. Prison imprisonment, community service, that's we now call unpaid work, probation, and probation with special requirements to reside in a place or attend a day training centre. As you can see, the predicted and actual rates are almost identical. One of the surprises here is that the highest risk people were actually being on probation rather than in the prison system. But these, as you can see, are quite large numbers. There's no evidence here that the sentence of the court has any effect. You would expect that there should be a reduction in the actual rate as compared to the predicted rate, but you don't see it. If you're not convinced by that, this exercise was repeated over a number of years. Have I given you both graphs here? It was repeated by several different sets of statisticians. Sorry, this is the largest single set of data that was used for that purpose. After programs were introduced, we see a number of different kinds of effects. Veronica Hollis is a Home Office researcher who's compared the predicted and actual recidivism rates for people attending programs. And this is what she found for the general offending behaviour programs of the kinds I mentioned earlier. Again, a fairly large sample. For those who completed the program, there's a 26% reduction in offending. And overall, taking dropouts into account, there was still a sizable reduction. As you'll see, for sexual offences, there was a very large reduction in reoffending amongst those who completed the programs. And for a number of other programs, there are also similarly large effects. Now, this isn't a comparison of two groups with each other. It's a comparison of predicted and actual rates. So you may say it's not the strongest kind of scientific evidence. But when you graph it, you see a drop. This is the sort of thing you would expect should be happening as a result of going to court. You come out of court, you get sentenced, you're less likely to reoffend than you were before. As we saw before, that wasn't actually happening. But now there is evidence that it is across all programs, and again, she has a fairly large sample here. To be fair, there is also evidence that this happens in prison. These are data taken from one of the most recent prison service reports, probably written by Phil Wheatley, who's here. The most recent National Offender Management Service report, I couldn't find a similar kind of graph in it, so I decided to use this one. But you'll see for different lengths of sentences in the early 2000s, which were the heyday of the use of programs in a way, you do see these reductions, up to 14% reduction for people doing different lengths of sentences, for longer sentences. So there is an effect, and this may tell us that the effect here for people doing fairly short sentences is not very large. The longer sentences, probably more serious offenders, probably more intervention, you're getting more of an effect. But those remain. I was going to hold up a little thing when it says I'm speculating here, with a little question mark face on it, and I guess that's what I'm doing at this point in time. The completion rate of programs in the community has been steadily increasing over time. During the initial period when this was being implemented, people became very worried at the very high dropout rate. But after this was bedded in more to community services, the rate virtually doubled. Our research was based on this period, so we had a high dropout rate. It's not been repeated in the same way since then. I would hypothesize that you would get a better effect if you were to have done that a few years later than the time we did it. Over a series of successive years, we actually saw a reduction in the national adult reoffending rate, the rate at which those people who are in the system as a whole go out and commit more crimes. From its peak in 2002, it gradually fell, and now, unfortunately, it appears to have risen again slightly. This is the latest year for which I can find data. Let me look at, on a larger scale, at what the implications of some of these things, and focus now into the argument that I'm trying to put forward about transfer resources to community settings. There are clear indications from several meta-analytic reviews of the importance of allocation in terms of risk. That's very important. Chris Lowenkamp at the University of Cincinnati has done a lot of this research, and he studied 97 programs throughout the state of Ohio, and he evaluated them using a thing called the CPAI, the Correctional Program Assessment Inventory, which tells you how about the quality of delivery of a program. And as the quality of delivery increased, the rate of recidivism of the people attending programs actually gradually went down. But there was also a large difference here according to whether or not deterrence was used. What they looked at were some programs where the main vehicle of change, if you like, was punishment itself. So deterrence-based models, D, and human services models, which is the adherence to the principles I mentioned earlier on, H, can be low, medium, or high integrity. So you get DL, DM, DH, HL, HM, HH. And these are effect sizes on criminal recidivism obtained from this. As you can see, these are positive effect sizes changing, people reducing their reoffending rate, whereas if you do deterrence, and especially if you don't do it very well, you actually get an increase in offending. So it's not simply the case, like some of the data we've looked at so far, that there's no difference. You're actually making people worse. And that's been found in a number of studies. Whereas if we adhere to these principles and we apply structured programs, you get positive effects. Now, programs have been criticized on the grounds that they are not the sole answer, and that's absolutely correct. They have to be delivered well. They have to be delivered by quite highly trained professional staff who are aware of a number of the dimensions of social interaction as they do this. And Dowden and Andrews, and more recently Don Andrews himself, reviewed what are called the non-programmatic factors. What are the other influences on individuals that may, if they are provided in a particular way in the delivery of a program, will make a difference? And these are some of the factors that were hypothesized to have that effect. The effective use of authority, modeling pro-social behavior, socially acceptable behavior, and challenging antisocial statements, teaching everyday problem-solving skills, and making effective use of community resources. And for example, the Yellow Ribbon Project that we've learned about here is a very stunning example of the very effective use and marshalling of community resources coherently to do that. Dowden and Andrews have actually shown that there's a correlation between the use of these methods, such as structured learning, teaching and training skills, effective modeling, effective reinforcement, effective disapproval. These are all across several, in some cases several hundred studies, are statistically significantly associated with program effects. So the programs themselves will have a certain effect. If you deliver them in a particular way with skilled staff who interact in specific ways, you make that effect higher still. If you don't do that, the less you do it, the less the effect you will obtain. There are a few studies in community settings that show how this can actually work. This is a study by Mario Paparozzi and Paul Gendreau of the New Jersey Intensive Supervision Program in the community. And they actually evaluated the supervision styles of community corrections officers. And they found that some were what they called very law enforcement oriented. They they went by the book, if you like. They said, here are the rules, this is what you've got to do. And they very quickly breached people if there was any violation of the conditions. Then there were people who we might say were very social work oriented. They were very sensitive. They were very concerned about the plight of offenders. And they were rather less well-boundaried. And then there were people who had a balanced approach, a good mixture of the two. They set boundaries, but within those boundaries they had a very therapeutic style in the way that they interacted with people. And these are their respective reconviction rates. And the people who get this balance get a lower reconviction rate from their supervisees, the people they're working with, than either of the other two groups. Lower rates of new convictions. They're sort of in between on technical violations. As you expect, the technical violations are highest amongst the more law enforcement-oriented officers. There's another study of this as well, although I've found relatively few studies on this. Jennifer Scheme has done this with offenders with mental health problems and evaluated the use of what she calls a dual role relationship. So your dual role, if you're a correctional officer, a probation officer, a prison officer, is both using authority but being a good counsellor for someone. And balancing those, we know, is a major challenge. But if you can do it, then you can get the best results. And Scheme and our colleagues have developed an inventory for evaluating people's performance in this respect called the Dual Role Relationships Inventory. And she found that the speed at which people violated the rules and their tendency to do so and their rates of revocation were better where people had the balanced better. They came out better on the at managing dual relationships. Back to programs again. I would be disappointed if the value of programs came to be lost sight of in corrections around the world, and particularly cognitive behavioural ones. This is Mark Lipsey and his colleagues' review of 58 studies of cognitive behavioural programs in a variety of settings. This is something called a forest plot. It means that the effect sizes are plotted in relation to this line here, which means it's an odds ratio. If the odds of success and failure are the same whether you're in the experimental group or the control group, then there's no difference, basically. If the odds of success go up in the experimental group, then you're doing well. So the more you get away from that one line, the better the effects, the lower the recidivism rate. And what Lipsey and his colleagues found, if you look at the result here, the mean odds ratio for cognitive behavioral programs is 1.53, which corresponds to a 25% reduction in recidivism overall. But they also found that there were studies with best practice features, and these were randomized controlled trials. They used what's called intent to treat analysis and a variety of other best practice features. Their odds ratio was 2.86, which corresponds to a 52% reduction. That's almost halving the crime rate amongst these groups. There's also a lot of evidence that these programs can be cost-effective, and this is one of the results from the Washington State Research Institute in Seattle. This line here represents no savings. The more you are to the right of this line, the more an investment in a program, whatever its costs in the short term, has led to benefits in the long term by reducing the rate of crime amongst the offenders who took part in it. Quickly skate over these, but this is a recent review by Farrington and Derek Jolliffe of programs for adults who've committed violence, again using odds ratios, although they're slightly calibrated. Sorry, these are effect sizes in a different way, but these are mainly positive effects. And colleagues and I have done a large review of the effectiveness of cognitive behavioral programs and other psychological programs in offenders with mental health programs. So this was what's called a systematic review, where we initially retrieved about 130,000 papers, of which we finally end up with 7 that are any good. Isn't that terrible? But that's what happens all the time in systematic reviews. And here are the results of this. The average effect size was positive and represented a reduction in recidivism of about 30%. So I want to summarize up and arrive at my main argument before I finish with this generous amount of time that I've been allocated. This graph summarizes the effects of cognitive behavioral interventions under different conditions. The very topmost figure is the best practice finding of Lipsey and his colleagues. This is a finding for cognitive behavioral therapy for sex offenders. This is the finding I mentioned just now in forensic mental health. This is the finding from Lipsey on CBT in general. This is the finding by Farrington and colleagues on programs for adult violence. This is also a very positive finding using a different model, prison therapeutic communities. This is Hollis's finding on the system-wide effectiveness of programs using mainly cognitive behavioral models, comparing predicted with actual rates. By comparison, the evaluations that we have so far of finding people jobs doesn't look very good. I think the reason for this is that finding people jobs is an excellent thing to do, but there is no real evidence of a correlation, a strong correlation between employment or unemployment and the crime rate. In fact, historical evidence suggests that when unemployment goes down, some kinds of crimes go up. When unemployment increases, other kinds of crimes go up. It's a very complex set of equations. If you want to alter the likelihood of someone committing future offences, you need to engage their thinking, their attitudes, engage them in learning new skills for managing the situations where they previously committed offences. And I interpret this evidence as saying that that's the best bet that we have for trying to reduce offending behaviour. What do we do at present? Well, we use punitive sanctions in hundreds of places around the world. Standard supervision, based on James Bonta and his colleagues' meta-analysis of that in Canada, does have a small positive effect. But here are the effects for other attempts to turn the heat up on offenders. Correctional boot camps, standard prison sentences. I'm going by the historic 1990s evidence of predicted versus actual offending. Scared straight programs, where you take young offenders and get them to meet very serious heavy-end offenders who've spent many years in prison, has no effect whatsoever. Intermediate punishment. Juvenile curfews. You would think keeping kids locked in their houses at night would stop them committing crimes, wouldn't you? It doesn't. Deterrence-based sanctions from other meta-analyses actually make things worse. Some of them increase offending by up to 20%. So this is the main lesson, if you like, of the sermon, is compare that graph with this graph and think, well, how useful is what we're doing at the moment? So if we coerce people into programs, we don't get as good effects as if they attend voluntarily. But this is also moderated by setting, and here I want to focus on the final part of my argument. This is a recent meta-analysis by Parhar and colleagues comparing levels of mandatory treatment with voluntary control, with coerced control, which means applying a lot of pressure to people, but they're not officially required to attend. As you can see, the level of participation and the effect on recidivism changes, but you get much better effects if you do this in the community than if you do it in prison. And there are other reasons why the community may be preferable as well. I wanted to make a comment on the idea of changing identities, because it's been suggested that programs can achieve certain results, but it's only when people decide to change that they will change. And then that's true. Whether that involves changing their identity, I'm uncertain. I think the meaning of this is rather uncertain. And I wonder how many individuals who've committed offences really have a criminal identity. I've interviewed several hundred offenders in my life, and I would say very few of them would have a criminal identity in the sense that that was how they defined themselves. They defined themselves as fathers or brothers or good sportsmen or something like this. And I can actually back that up with a little bit of evidence, because when I was first involved in research in prisons, I did a survey of prisoners about to be released and asked them what their release problems were. 98% of these prisoners said getting a job, and about 85% said something to do with their families would be a problem. Only 17% said reoffending would be a problem. Now, that might be the kind of illusional state that people are in inside. They think this is never going to happen again. But I think that changing identity, even addressing crime, is often low down people's list of priorities. And one of the best ways of reinforcing a criminal identity, of course, is to send people to prison. I also find this slightly worrying. Is it the role of the state to change people's identities? I personally find it slightly intrusive. I think if someone offends, the state has the right to say, I'm going to stop you doing that, or at least I'm going to try. But I'm not sure the state has the right to say, you have to change your identity. But it depends what we mean by the term identity. Now, if we were going to embark on this departure that I'm arguing for of transferring very large numbers of people, and I mean very large numbers of people, out of prison in societies where there are large numbers there, we might think that this is such a leap into the dark that we can't do it. But there are actually some precedents. This is one of them. Over a period of about 20 years, from 1960 onwards, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people were moved out of psychiatric hospitals into the community all around the world. This movement took off in the USA, but it spread to the United Kingdom and Italy. Here are the numbers. For example, in the United States in 1960, there were more than 500,000 patients in psychiatric hospitals. By 1985, that number had fallen to less than 120,000. Now, everybody expected mayhem. There will be all these seriously disturbed people on the streets. And for a time, there were problems because the community services that were provided were not up to the job. There was a presidential commission to address these problems in the late 1960s, and extra resources were allocated. Where good community services were provided, there was evidence that people were being far better managed in the community than they had been in hospitals, where many of them had been deteriorating. Some people were concerned of what is known as the Penrose effect. Some people call it Penrose's law. If you reduce the number of people in hospitals, you'll increase the number in prison, and so on. But there's actually been some studies in the Nordic countries which showed that this was not the case, and a recent review by some Australian researchers using data from the UK and other countries has challenged the view that this is a cause-effect relationship. If numbers in prison go up, that's not driven by numbers in hospital going down. There are other factors that are responsible for it. The second example, and more directly relevant, is what's called the Massachusetts Reform Schools experiment. This was largely down to the energy of one man, Miller, who was the director of youth services in Massachusetts in the early 1970s, Jerome Miller. The reform schools in Massachusetts had been around for 130 years, so they look pretty, that they're going to be around forever. During a very hectic 2-year period, after he was appointed, he let them all out. He let them all out into the community, setting up ad hoc community arrangements for 1,500 who were thought to be highly recidivistic, quite dangerous young offenders. All but 49 were released. Only 49 who were thought, we just can't let them go. They need to be confined and incapacitated. That's 3.3%. There was an expected crime wave. The Boston newspapers were predicting mayhem in the streets, etc. But that never occurred. And there have been follow-up studies going into the 1990s of this, and there are no differences in the recidivism rates of those discharged young offenders and comparison groups from other states. In fact, where the good quality community services are provided, rates of recidivism went down. And even into the 1990s, Massachusetts continued to have more cost-effective services for young offenders than other American states. If we compare costs, we'll see that we all know that the community will be a cheaper option because we have the accommodation services of imprisonment, which are very, very high. But for example, in the USA, being in a Bureau of Prisons facility in 2008 cost $25,000. A community correctional centre, which is actually a lock-up place, $23,000. Supervision by a probation officer cost $3,000. Here are a couple of examples of states comparing the costs of drug treatment in the two settings. 20 is against 4,000 in Maryland, 27,000 is against 4,500 in California. In Illinois, they calculated in 2005 if they had implemented community drug treatment for 10,000 prisoners instead of sending them to prison, the state would have saved $223 million. These are not small amounts of money. So what would we do if we were going to do this? I should say in the UK, the average cost of imprisonment, the most up-to-date figure I have is from the report I quoted earlier. It was about £28,000, although it goes up or down depending on the level of security in the facility. £28,000 is slightly above the average annual salary of a probation officer. So every prisoner could have his own or her own probation officer full-time if you release them all, which is not a bad way to think about it. Of course, we need prison for some proportion of those individuals. Some of them are too risky to themselves or to others, and we've seen that being in prison, particularly for those who've committed more serious offences and for long periods of time, can reduce recidivism. So what we need to do is put our thinking caps on and say, how could we do this? One possible thing to do would be to remove the power to imprison from magistrates, who are lower courts in England and Wales. I don't know how many different jurisdictions have these, but they send people to period for very short terms, very short periods. I have been involved with the British Psychological Society in commenting on proposals to build new prisons in London. 61% of prisoners in London are serving less than 1 year. The rate of unemployment amongst those offenders is actually not as high as in other parts of the country. So what we do is, by sending them to prison for a short period of time, take them away from their families, they lose their jobs. We don't have them in prison long enough to assess them properly, so they go out with their needs unknown. I would have to say that it sounds to me like a completely futile exercise to lock people up for these relatively short periods of time. If you like, the villains here are the people who are making the decisions. It's not the prison service, it's the courts, quite often. I would advocate carrying out RNR, the model I mentioned, assessments of large numbers of offenders as to their suitability for release and what their needs would be if they were transferred to the community or not sent there in the first place. And someone was saying the other day, the best form of re-entry preparation is not to admit to begin with. So that would be a good step. But once that they are there, can we transfer them out? This would also obviously involve a large process of recruitment of community correctional staff and of training of them. And in the UK, we have an integrated agency. In other countries where it would require very careful interagency working, perhaps through a specially convened working group to oversee this process. These are some sources for the things that I've been mentioning, and I'm going to unashamedly plug a couple of books here coming out. They're not edited by me, but some of the material I've given here is in this chapter. Look out for this book. It's actually, it may already be published, but they haven't sent me a copy yet. It's called Applying Social Science to Reduce Violent Offending. It's an initiative of the American Psychology Law Society, and it should be out later this year, even though it's 2012. And this is an update on what works that will appear next year, edited by Liam Craig, Joanne Dixon, and Teresa Gannon. And the most recent update on the meta-analysis is this one, and this is the evaluation of the community programs I mentioned earlier on. Thank you very much.
Well, scholarship, my friends, is being able to pull together evidence from so many different sources and deriving from it a logical, coherent argument. A lot of stuff that was presented to you by James, and I just want to make the point that hopefully, quickly, we'll have all of the overheads for you, for some of you who want to look over them a little more carefully on the ICPA website. So we'll open it up now. Please, any questions for James? Lots of food for consideration in many of his remarks. Would anybody like to be bold enough to ask the first question? You blew them away, James. Huh? Is there a hand there? Okay. Microphone in the center. Phil.
I can add some commentary rather than a question, though there may be a question out of it. If you look at the reducing reoffending results that you show going up to 2004 and then beginning to rise, it's worth plotting against that the supply of new money. Because in 2004, the prison service and the probation service began to have to save money. That was the end of the new money. So the caseload went up, the money stayed either static or reduced, and from that point onwards, we stopped getting improvements. We more or less held the position. Do you think that's likely to be related is one question. And I can update the results on the 4-year and over group, which are something like a 25% improvement in the latest data over the 10-year period. And I think it's 22.3% for the 2 to 4 year group, and 12% for the 1 to 2 year group, and about 5% for the under 12-month group, which we do nothing. Would you like to sort of have any commentary on that additional data? Because that's a very large treatment effect for the long sentence prisoners, looking at predicted reoffending versus actual reoffending.
Thank you. Is this on? Can people hear from this?
Should be on.
It's got a green light.
Press it.
Oh, no, it is on. It had to have a green light and a red light. Thank you very much for that. No, I'm sure that resources play a very large part in this, and if you reduce them, then it just is the plain truth that good services cost money. So I would completely expect that's an effect of a squeeze on budgets that's responsible for that, because then shortcuts are made, quality of delivery goes down. No matter how well motivated people are, they're working under more pressure and trying to fit more things into a day. I would be very interested in your own views, Phil, on to what extent you think that may, a component of that, because I think it would be an exaggeration to say that to the extent that the positive effects were there, it was due to programs, it was due to regimes and a whole range of things. And I wouldn't have the evidence to be able to dismantle that and show which bit was which. But because there's a kind of synergy between the program effects and the other effects of regime change and so on. I wonder if that seems agreeable to you, that seems an acceptable position to you. Sorry, is this on? That's precisely why I think that desistance has something to offer, because I think we were getting a program effect, doing the programs, which didn't reach everyone, because the number of programs that were available nowhere near matched the number of people entering the system. Most people didn't get programs. Nevertheless, there were still improvements, and it looks as though general regime and the way staff approached them was also another factor that began to make a difference, as opposed to old-style traditional prisons or old-style traditional probation, which didn't seem to make any difference. Yes.
I agree with you. I think particularly for short-termers, reinforced their criminal identity. They came in, slept on a bed, thought they were real hard men because they'd come into a prison and went out feeling rougher and tougher, having lost their jobs and their girlfriends, even less likely to go straight.
Yes, I completely agree. And sorry, I'm not suggesting that there isn't added value in the desistance model. I think I've got slight anxiety sometimes that it's going to kick out, mean that programs get discarded, which I would, but everyone's saying that they are compatible, and I completely agree that they are.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Fredrik Dahlin, the R&D unit of the Swedish Prison Probation Service. There is somewhere also a tendency of calling different activities in the prison services programs. Could be playing soccer, could be workshops, activities, assembling, laundry. Anything the prisoners do could be called a program, although it doesn't fulfill any of your theoretical requirements of what a program actually is. Are there, to the best of your knowledge, any evidence that sports programs, workshop works, etc., have any effect on recidivism?
Well, it actually reminds me of some research I was doing in youth justice, where we were going to train people to run groups with offenders, and the man who was there, a youth justice worker, said, "Oh, we already do group work." I said, "Oh, what do you do?" He said, "Well, we do a footballing group." And it meant that they did play football. Yes, there's value in sport. There's value. I mean, what I'm talking about is how we reduce recidivism. We might do that by a general feel-good factor. We might increase people's ability to relate to each other by working in teams. But these are not very reliable effects. They're very diffuse effects that are difficult to capture and to put to work in the way that we want. There is a different agenda, of course, which is the well-being of individuals, and we should provide them all the things that every other citizen has to maintain their well-being should be provided to people in prison or on probation. That's a human rights issue, not a criminal justice recidivism issue. Whether those things will have an effect, I think there's very little evidence that they will have an effect on recidivism. If we want to do that, I go back to what I said, which is that we need to engage the thinking processes, the attitudes, the skill deficiencies that individuals have. People sometimes dismiss the idea of skill deficiency. It's like you're writing someone off. I don't really understand that. I've got skill deficiencies. I can't play the oboe. I've got a skill deficiency in driving heavy goods vehicles. I don't have a license. So I openly admit that's a deficiency. But I'm probably not deficient in being able to walk away if someone offers me a fight. Whereas I know some people who would not be able to resist that. And so skill deficiency is not a very negative thing to say about someone. It's a need that can be rectified. And I don't really think that the skill deficiencies that have a bearing and the cognitive influences that have a bearing on committing crimes are very much influenced by a lot of the things that we do by way of sport and so on. But that's not a reason for not doing them. It's just a reason for limiting our expectations of them.
Yeah, go ahead. Microphone.
Oh, thank you. No more questions.
I thought he had his hand up. Do you want to go to the microphone? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Mike Tauzik from the U.S. I'm a director of a reentry center in the U.S. My question is about dosage. I'm continually striving to reach the 200 and 300 hours that's put forth by the University of Cincinnati and Latessa. And I'm just trying to get your feelings on that because it's very difficult to aspire to that level with a small staff.
Okay, well,
point.
Pardon me. Yes.
Good point.
I guess the evidence is that there is a kind of dosage effect here, and Mark Lipsey and others have said you should be offering at least 100 hours of what he called correctional programming, and others have put the figure higher. As you can see, we've had positive effects here from programs that are shorter than this. They're still longer than some of the CBT, the more therapeutic ones in mental health that we saw brought about changes. And by the way, those people were clinically far better off than they had been at the beginning, after only 17 to 20 hours of some kind of therapy. So I think it is possible to get effects, and they could be valuable effects and statistically significant effects, and ones that could be seen in the local crime statistics. But the more of it you do, the better. I think the quality is probably as important as the quantity. But we have to be realistic. We've just been talking about cost cuts. The same applies in correctional settings. I don't want to disagree with colleagues in Cincinnati, but just to say that you need to take what you can from the messages that they're giving and apply them in the best way under the conditions in which you're working.
Thanks, James. I wanted to ask a question because you pointed out that the assistance framework that we heard about the other day, Fergus McNeil talked to us about that you're concerned that it might make programs become out of fashion. And I see the two really, the link between the two is really important. I guess what I would ask you is, do you think we could teach some of these skills that you say can affect the brain, etc., to people who don't yet want to learn them?
Up to a point, yes. The Prahar meta-analysis shows that people can be coerced. It just doesn't work so well. There's studies from drug rehabilitation showing that when it's mandatory, you can get effects that are almost as good as when it's completely voluntary, but they'll never be quite as good. But that's where motivational programs like For a Change come in. If you want, and that is where the desistance model does come in. That if you say this is a reluctant group, this is a group that they don't understand what I'm saying when I suggest you've got a problem here, that you simply have to wait for them to think about it. And the most successful we'll ever be will always be quite a long way short of 100%. But that's still not bad going compared to other public services. No public service achieves a huge proportion of its objectives in any case.
And a question for the audience. James is arguing that we should be more bold in arguing for decarceration, emptying out our prisons. What do you guys think about that? Any comments on that? Are we not bold enough? If you're convinced by the evidence that James has tried to summarize, why aren't we arguing more strongly, being more bold in our position? Anybody want to comment on that?
There was one over there.
Will you?
The gentleman from...
Where?
Yeah.
Okay, again, Mike.
I actually see it firsthand with my program. We're a brand new program in the state of Maine. And although I did reentry in Massachusetts and with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the state at first was very reluctant to accept reentry. It was just something very non-traditional to them. And I get the feedback from prisoners coming in that are given a chance. One individual in particular, 23 years he's been down, and he just absorbs a lot of the programming that we're doing, and he's really appreciative of it. It's just, particularly in the U.S., although there's a slight trend towards more community correctional settings for fiscal reasons, that there's still that pressure from the states and from the public and correctional administrators that is something that they don't want to see. It's not across the board, but I think it's still relatively evident there.
Thank you. Any other comments on that and what's holding us back in being more bold? Yeah, Leo.
Well, I didn't want to comment on that, but on a general note, CEP is always pleading for non-custodial options because we believe it's more effective. You are avoiding a lot of problems you would otherwise have when sending people to prison, and it's cheaper. But I was a little bit puzzled by the impression I got from your lecture that you equate non-custodial options with following programs. And I can understand that you are a little bit afraid that with the new thinking about desistance, the importance of programs might disappear. And I think that is a real concern. I believe we need them. But I also believe that only giving people the possibility to follow programs will not really help them change themselves. Because after they have followed a session, they will the next day face a problem which might immediately give them a dip into their motivation. And if then there is no person who really helps them to talk this over and to assist them in real terms, not only by expressing encouragement, but also by helping them in, for instance, advocacy towards institutions, then I think programs are not effective as they could have been if there was that, well, intensive or structured supervision that you were talking about.
I completely agree with that. The program that I wrote was designed with that in mind. The Think First program consists of in the community, consists of 4 sessions that are preparatory. They're done individually with the supervising officer. Then there's 22 group sessions which are provided by group tutors, specially trained. And then there's a series of 6 sessions which are meant to be done by the individual supervising officer as the beginning of the rest of the period of supervision. And in that period, the individual identifies high-risk situations where an offence might occur, and they agree an agenda of skills that might be used and applied to tackle them when they occur. And the rest of supervision would then be completely open-ended. It would be providing exactly what you've said, the support to say, I had a failure yesterday, this happened, what do I do, and continue that through. So it's a kind of mentoring type of arrangement within supervision. So the program is meant to bring about some change in itself, but also be a catalyst for the rest of supervision, doing precisely what you have wanted, precisely what you've suggested, yes. So what I'm saying is I think that those processes can be built into to programming. But yeah, the desistance model, they're the same thing when it comes to that, yeah.
Yeah, good point. Yes. Can you introduce yourself, Bob?
Yes, Bob Brown from Canada. And a couple of slides are sticking in my mind. One related to the very low efficiency to employment programs. And then the other slide was the one that came up and basically said that the concern for the offender going out, 98% were concerned with employment upon return to the community. Is there some kind of marriage between employment programs and CBT that could improve the employment program so it would go up higher and address that issue that the offenders are concerned with?
That's difficult to say. I would hope that there would be. The figure in the graph there is taken from a meta-analysis of employment programs by Vischer, which was published about 7 or 8 years ago. I don't think there's been another one since then. But earlier in his reviews, Lipsey showed that if you prepare people for jobs, you do vocational preparation, and there are no jobs there, their recidivism actually goes up. So you're really doing them a disservice by doing that. I guess the ideal arrangement would be that you do both. If you can engage people in all of the activities that we think are associated with changing their approach to risky situations where they might commit offences, and also enable them to obtain jobs. But the effectiveness of obtaining jobs as such appears to me to be limited by a number of factors. I mean, a large proportion of people in employment commit crimes at any time. And long-term macroeconomic modelling, which has been replicated in a number of countries, shows that the level of consumption in a society, which is a factor of how well it's doing in GDP terms and its level of unemployment and so on, fluctuates and differentially influences different kinds of crimes. In the UK, the rate of house burglary and property crime goes up when unemployment goes up. But when unemployment goes down and more people are in jobs, they have more money to buy alcohol, and the rate of violence goes up. So the relationship between employment and crime is quite complex. Having said that, it's good in many ways to have a job. It is good for one's sense of identity, well-being, and obviously if you're providing for others, it's pivotal. So I'm not arguing against helping offenders to get jobs. I'm saying that the impact of that on their criminality may be limited.
Yeah, when it's done on its own.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's part of the problem with evaluations when you look at only one aspect of intervention with offenders, right? Anything else? We have about 5 minutes, unless I let you out early. One more question. I'll let you up from school early then. Any? Show hands. One. Going once. Okay. I want you to join me in giving James a warm hand of applause for putting this together for us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you very much, James. I particularly like that you created some controversy as well. So thank you very much. And here's a little something.
Oh, thank you.
From Thank you very much. And I'm compelled, I have to make this announcement for those of you who have signed up for the visits to the prisons and the halfway house tomorrow. There's information, if you don't already have it, for where you should assemble at the foyer on level 4. Okay? Thank you very much, and enjoy the closing of our conference this year after coffee break. Take care.